I run an organization called the Centre for Public Impact. We are a not-for-profit foundation that was established about 6 years ago, using funding from the Boston Consulting Group, which is my former employer. And BCG is now a core funder of CPI, although we're a separate legal entity. We're a not-for-profit. And what actually the BCG funding has allowed us to do is to build an organization which now has a team in the US, a team in Europe, a team in Australia, New Zealand, just getting started in India as well, and ambitions to be elsewhere in the world, and to do so with a sort of guaranteed core funding, which is such a privilege in the not-for-profit space, as many of you will know, to have that kind of backing. It also means that we can leverage the BCG network and name and brand and the knowledge that they're generating to help us to pursue our mission. But our mission is different from BCG's, where we're not about maximizing any return for anybody. We're trying to, in the words we use, reimagine government, or help reimagine government, because we believe that the kinds of challenges that we face in society today, and we could all list them out: climate, inequality, the challenges of an aging society, AI, etc. These are complex challenges that can't be, we believe, that can't be solved using more traditional, and in the public sector, more sort of technocratic or managerial ways of working, ways of thinking. We need to try something very, very different, we believe. But in order to do that, it requires, what you might call, and I know it's a bit hackneyed, but a paradigm shift. And if it is a paradigm shift, that is extremely, extremely difficult. And I know that through your work, Andy, and many of you on this call now, we're basically all, in our own different ways, trying to nudge the system in many different areas in a direction that feels more purposeful and suitable, I suppose, for the nature of the challenges we face, and able to really allow everyone to contribute in a way which is fulfilling and likely to achieve the best outcomes, really. So in terms of the work we do at CPI, we work with a range of either governments or their partners, people who are interested in public sector, and that can include at the national level, through regions and down to cities. So in the US, for example, we work a lot with cities, which is where there's a lot of interesting stuff happening. I'm guessing most people on the call are I'm British, as you can tell from my accent. I live in Sweden, as you won't be able to tell from anything at the moment. Although personal news update, I picked up my Swedish passport yesterday, so I'm now a Swedish citizen, which feels very odd to say. But yes, I've been living here in Sweden for the last 4 years. But I wondered whether, just to stimulate the conversation for this group now, and I'm happy, we can go whichever way, as Andy said, to explore together. I've been thinking a little bit about the levelling up agenda, given its salience in the UK right now, and the fact that the Prime Minister and Michael Gove and others are sort of putting it front and centre. And it strikes me that regardless of your politics, you might. Let me give you the optimistic, hopeful spin on this, right? I do think this is an opportunity for those of us that believe in a more radical transformation in the state is required. This is an opportunity to make a case for that, actually, and potentially to have the ears of those decision makers who could do something about it in a way that is not normally the case. And one of the jobs I did in my past was working in the Cabinet Office in Number 10 when Blair was Prime Minister. So I have some small sense of how change happens when working at that level. And I do get the sense that with levelling up, the question that's being asked is one way of answering that is to say, we need a transformation of the role of the state, similar to a sort of Beveridge kind of moment, where we fundamentally relook at what we think the state is for, how we think the state should act, how it should organize itself, and as a result of all of that, therefore, what is the relationship between localities and what you might call Whitehall, or the more centralized public services. And I suppose the pitch I would make if I had Michael Gove's ear, which I do not, but if I did, I would say, of course, I understand the short-term political pitch here, with the next election in mind and the need to make, some sort of program achieve something so that they can go to the electorate and say we have leveled up. But nobody really believes that leveling up is anything other than a generational mission. And that's even before we define what leveling up means. But if we mean roughly, it's about creating opportunity and empowering different communities to be able to progress much more quickly than they have to date, and to start to reduce the gaps in the country, then I think it necessarily implies, I don't see how you can be serious about that agenda and not be talking about quite a radical transformation of the state writ large. And if it ends up being just about sort of a narrow version of sort of economic localism or something, then I do think it's a missed opportunity. Now, again, say what you will about Johnson, I think he thinks of himself as a prime minister who's going to reform Britain, who's going to lead, be the big heroic leader. And I think if he had an inkling that levelling up could be about sort of reimagining the state in the UK, to that degree, he might be kind of attracted to it. He may not care much about the details of it, but I could see how you might be able to pitch him on that. Now, whether that's likely or not, I don't know, but it does raise for me the question of, for people like me, and I welcome other views on this, but I think for any of us who claim to be serious about changing things, and to the degree many of us sort of argue on blogs and in forums like this, I would say now is the time, now is a time to be getting out and working out how we can, either individually or collectively, be making a case as part of this agenda, because I do think it's an opportunity. That's probably enough. I don't know if that's a provocation or a completely incoherent ramble, but I'll stop there, and I'm just really interested to listen and learn from everyone on this call.
I'll leave you wallowing in the uncertainty of whether it was provocation or incoherent ramble, Adrian. But just to be devilish, can I just throw it open to everyone? These calls seem to go best when it's a case of we just get stuck in, so you can ask questions, give answers, make alternative points. You don't need to talk to me or Adrian specifically, just go where it takes you. But I'll play the role of, if I need to, chairing things. So over to you folks. Anyone like to come in? Nope. Well, thank you for coming.
I can start out just to get conversation going, but I don't have good thoughts or well thought out thoughts about any of this, but I'm very intrigued by it. I'm in the States, over in Chattanooga. Been learning a lot about complexity and reimagining organizations, and just I think the world's been pointing me in this direction. It's like all these little signs are showing me that this is the way the world is going. And then I look around my actual work environment, my world that I'm operating in, and it doesn't reflect what I'm seeing as where it needs to go. So there's a disconnect in my mind of what's emerging in my mind to what I see and where I exist. I was curious. I'm curious also about this idea of, like, is this going to be at what scale and probably it's yes and all scales, but I'm curious at what scale this makes the most sense. This type of governmental revolution, does it have to happen at the local kind of evolutionary bottom up scale, or does it have to be this, or is it going to be a top down kind of thing? I kind of question the validity of a top down model with this approach being something that could change, but I'm open and interested if that's possible. But I kind of wanted to hear folks' thoughts on that.
Thanks, Tim. That was super helpful. Laura.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting thinking this through. Like, I was thinking about, because I've worked in the Northeast for loads of years and seen so many kind of, in some ways, great initiatives that have come in, like New Deals for Community, or money and investment pouring into a place that's seen as a deprived place. So really relevant to levelling up. And I think they do no harm and probably do some good things. But then 20 years later, that the outcomes for people in those places haven't changed. And I think I saw a really it was a bit of a sort of depressing and was it Booth that did maps of poor areas of London years ago, very deficit based, I know, but did these maps, but actually 100 years later those places are that map would still look the same. So it's about how do we genuinely do this, not just pouring in money, not pouring in infrastructure. So it is really difficult, and my thoughts aren't, I haven't, as you can tell, sort of really got sort of formed thoughts in this. But for me, the work I do with, say, central government is lots of really interesting things going on, but just saying, oh, we get stuck when it comes to the minister. Or work I do on local level, people just feeling, for some reason, like the local authority is their enemy rather than their friend in trying to do things differently. And so I guess where I come to is this is about people currently with power, especially in sort of government roles locally or nationally, having to give up power. And that's really difficult here. And, whilst Boris Johnson, I think, I sort of was really interested in what you were saying, Adrian, because I think, my sense is he wants a legacy, he'd love a great legacy. But actually, when that legacy involves giving up power, does he really, what would that look like? So, they're just my thoughts, really.
Sam?
I don't know if I believe or trust him, but Michael Gove has kind of been saying what sounds like some of the right things recently. He did like a fringe event at the Conservative Party conference, and he's in cahoots with a think tank called New Local. They used to be called the NLGN. And he is talking a lot about how levelling up needs to be driven from communities upwards rather than kind of top down from central government. And I mean, I can't profess to have read or listened to everything you've said, but the few snippets I've got seem to be like, oh, I'm sort of agreeing with Michael Gove here, and which I was surprised by. So there might be some hope. I don't know. I guess it depends if you believe or trust him.
One of the things I'm curious about that I think you've both touched on there is if it requires a letting go or a giving up of power. I'm also curious about to what extent it requires a stopping giving away of the power, allowing others to have the power, if you like. So to what extent, Adrian touched on the role of the state in relation to local institutions and I guess citizens as well in communities. And I'm wondering to what extent we need to be doing the enabling or even the provoking work to say, hold on to your power, use it, don't give it to the centre or whatever. Any takers?
Do you mean the sort of thought that we have more power than we realise? And
well, maybe. I honestly don't know, but I have a sense that it would be. I have a sense that to some extent we're so institutionalized in centralized ways of deploying policy and so on that we need to rediscover our sort of agency and our capabilities, and maybe these things sit hand in glove. Maybe some of the reluctance to let go of power is that people keep giving them it. You know.
I think I sometimes think of power as zero sum, which is sort of sits behind your question, Andy. Sort of there's a certain amount of power to go around, and if someone else is empowered, it doesn't necessarily mean someone else is giving it up. And on one level, I think that's a reasonable analysis. And Laura, to your point, that's, you know, that reinforces this idea that unless those with power are willing to give it up, it's hard to see how there's going to be any meaningful empowerment of others. On the other hand, so I do think there's truth to that. On the other hand, I think what we need to try and have a way of articulating perhaps a little bit better than we have done to date are the different modes of operating, or different forms of power. So the center can still be, and I think on the podcast I talked about the Finnish school system as an example. The higher levels in that system have very important role to play, which is still a powerful role in terms of, if you like, creating the infrastructure that enables better collaboration and learning in the system. And that is a role that it's very difficult to play that from other parts of the system. And clearly, if you're, you know, centrally located somewhere, you can do that perhaps better than anyone else. And it's a powerful role because you get to kind of determine the rules of engagement to some extent, and you can do that more or less well. But that's a very different form of power, in a sense, the power to enable than the power to control, which is perhaps what we tend to think of when we're thinking of power. So the way I would respond to that is, can we have a more diverse understanding of what power is, a greater taxonomy of power, such that those in power can be reassured in a sense that they're still really important, and we still need, we still sort of need them in that sense. But what we definitely don't need them to do is to tell everybody what to do all the time. That's the worst wielding of it's the counterproductive wielding of power that's the most annoying for all of us, right? Or the, utterly depressing, if you want to take it further. We did publish a paper at CPI a couple of years ago, and I can see Nadine Smith on this call who was involved with it, thinking about shared power, what we were calling shared power. And we started to get into this. I don't think we didn't take the argument as far as perhaps I'm suggesting now, but to I suppose challenge ourselves about our conception of power, and if we're shorthanding to power as control, can we think of other forms of power that actually might be more productive in this conversation?
So again, anyone want to come in there? I've got a couple of
Well,
thoughts.
Since Adrian mentioned me, I guess I better say something. Hi, Adrian. I think, so just having sort of been fresh from central government meetings on this this very question this week, I think I'm not sure there's an unwillingness to let go of control. I wonder, but there's definitely a willingness to try and think about where they can. I think there's a lack of conversation about where it could be possible for that letting go of control to happen in a way which makes everybody feel okay. So looking at a very kind of formulaic, standardized kind of set of kind of evaluation questions, for example, there are conversations that can be had at the right time about whether or not that is the right thing to do and how we can best do it. And I'm noticing that people are open to the conversation, but I think sometimes the answers are coming at government as kind of almost too radical. And I think all of us on this call are probably here because we are see the title of the radical. But I think there's I think as a community, we need to help each other kind of find ways of having these conversations which will enable people to move a bit. And I know that's not the kind of radical answer, because really what we'd rather is not have these questionnaires, evaluations and measurement kind of processes at all. But in the absence of that, are we willing to have a conversation about what's an alternative that we can begin to start to have those safe kind of spaces to try? And I don't know whether or not there are enough of those conversations going on, but when you start to have them, I'm not feeling an unwillingness to try. And I wonder if we've got enough of those spaces to have these discussions. And then secondly, whether or not as a group of people who are desperate for change, we're willing to go, we have to go all or nothing. And I think there's a sort of conversation that many of you often have is, you know, if you're just going to do it half-heartedly, is there any point doing it at all? But I'm starting to think it's not half-hearted to do it, to start to do it in a way that you feel safe and that you can yourself feel, you know, if you're going to let go of some control, you let go slowly. It's like you don't send your kid out at 18 then you've never let them out the house before. You know, you're slowly kind of gradually helping to get there. And I know we haven't got 18 years, but we've got, is there a way of doing it is what I'm trying to say, and a mode of doing it, and that we can all kind of get behind. Because I kind of find myself a lot in the middle of, that's not good enough, we need to go stronger, that's not radical enough, there's no point doing it. And I'm not sure that's not always true. I think sometimes there's a middle ground, but I think that's a hard thing to say in these sorts of conversations.
Thanks, Nadine. Again, I could come in, but let me leave it with the group.
Yeah,
Tim,
can I
put your hand up.
This is the challenge I'm having. And so Adrian, I had a conversation with John, your CPI contact over on this side of things, about, I called it messaging. I'm not sure what it is, but it's just like, I'm really struggling on how to even have a conversation. And it's, I don't have a good vocabulary for it. You know, it's this idea of focusing on, you know, on learning, and how do I articulate the emphasis, like the strategy is the learning as opposed to the outcome that we seem to be so focused on, you know, and building those systems and networks where people can actually be a learning, growing organizations, kind of in the human learning systems model. Yeah, and that's where I really struggle. It's like, how do I message that? I think you gave some suggestions of, like, you know, the difference between the maps, not the territory, and these other kinds of things. But I just I keep on going back to this deep desire of a lot of people I work with, especially in the council. So we're a city council form of government, a deep desire to have control and to know with certainty, this does this, or this produces this. And anything that hints at that we don't actually know what that is very scary, and people don't want to hear it. I'm curious how other people are having these conversations and how they're messaging in it. And are you tiptoeing like we're talking about, and slowly? I just, I'm a little bit at loss on how to kind of move this forward and what this needs to be. Part of me wants to have like I don't know, just a convening, just to talk about this, to just even broach the subject and say, like, you know, who else is there that kind of is having the same thought? Because the general sense I get is, once you actually talk to people who do the work and who are trying to move the needle on these programs, they all know that it's a little hubristic, that, you know, we're not actually making changes in people's lives. And, you know, all the indicators, or a lot of the indicators, don't point to the narrowing of the gaps, but even widening. And so it's just like, what are we doing here?
All right.
I think I sort of see a real growing momentum of conversations a lot in my work. I see just these conversations are happening all the time, or it might be my kind of echo chamber, but, you know, I think it's happening a lot. But I think, you know, what Nadine raised around, you know, is it incremental change, or do we need some big disruption, is really, in some ways, the big question. Because I see, so local authority near where I am here, they actually sort of employed and invested in someone who I think is really, really quite radical as a sort of transformation lead, and he reports to the chief exec of the council, and was given a lot of autonomy and power, but still he'll just say, you know, this stuff is much harder than any of us thought. And when you start doing it, I mean, I speak from the organisation I work for, Changing Lives, which Andy knows well because he's held our hand over quite a few months of trying to do this. It gets deeper and deeper, and it's harder and harder. I mean, it's great, and we're on a journey here, but it's really, really hard because people feel. I think there's something around. We have to start talking about feelings here, and people feel there's this balance of feeling really uncontained. And I was in a meeting the other day with lots of our teams who are just grappling with this, going, and literally in the same breath, they were sort of saying, we want you to tell us what to do. And at the same time, they said, we want to be involved in all the decisions, you know, or don't ever make a decision without us being involved, you know, and it's really difficult stuff. And I was thinking, I was listening to, you know, you mentioned Sam Donna, the local, New Local,
yeah.
Donna Hall. And I mean, she's very honest when she talks, saying the reason she could make the radical changes she made in Wigan was because there was such cuts, I mean, she was honest, saying this sounds really awful, and she says this publicly. She had to get rid, you know, basically made 50% of people redundant and used that as a way to sort of keep the willing, because otherwise it's very difficult to do this. So I don't really know where I'm saying with that, but I think that sort of radical or the incremental, I think what I see is sometimes with the incremental, it just gets pulled back all the time. And I think something does have to happen. There needs to be some rupture in some ways for something to happen.
Well, I wonder if that's kind of a big part of it. It's just, it's really hard. And it's obviously hard if you're someone without power, because kind of where do you start? You don't have agency. But actually for those who have the power, it's really hard to give up these old ways of doing things. And it's not just hard in that it's like learning a new skill. Like if I wanted to like learn some DIY or something like that, which I'm useless at, but actually it's learning to think in a very, very different way about this stuff. So things like, you know, nerds like me will talk about kind of like emergence and things like that, and actually can't, you know, plan and predetermine everything. And actually, but getting in that mindset of actually not just sort of seeing it on a rational level, but actually sort of feeling it and living it. And it's even things like I listened to the podcast, which I thought was really good, Andy and Adrian. And I know you spoke about climate change on there. And what interests me is actually talking about climate change is the old paradigm, because you're reducing it to one issue when there's this kind of big assault on the natural world, which there's like, people will silo it into climate change and, I don't know, soil erosion and air pollution and things like that. And then they set targets for climate change. And actually the easiest way to meet those targets for climate change is to outsource it to a country, normally a poorer one, so they can do all the polluting and you kind of get away with it. So it's not actually having that broader impact. So all of these things, they're all still being spoken about. And I know you used the word paradigm earlier, Adrian, but they're all kind of being spoken about in this same way, because it's so much easier to do it in that way, to think you can fix climate change when we know that complex problems can't be fixed. So kind of, I suppose I should probably ask a question or something, but maybe to sort of Adrian around, you know, sort of that, I suppose that's what you're doing. I suppose you're still working it out yourselves, is how you, people in government or other places in power, how we can help them to take this more, whether you call it complexity informed approach, that's probably just not the best tagline for it and won't get people behind it, but just to help them move, not just to learn a new thing or a new skill, but actually to learn a different way of seeing the world or a different way of thinking about things. So you can sort that out for us, Adrian. No biggie.
It's a question that we ask ourselves all the time at CPI, because we can be the angry, shouty, ranty one in the room, and I probably, you know, I've been that many times in the past, demanding the radical change, or we can be the helpful, supportive, sort of, we'll go on the learning journey with you one. I mean, it's a pretty decent strategy, which is one that we follow to seek out those who are willing to go on the journey, who have got some awareness of what this is about, and then work with them rather than trying to convince the skeptics, because we'll waste all of our time trying to convince the skeptics, whereas we should, we could make good progress working with the sort of willing. I do wonder whether, partially I think back to, and I don't think I talked about in this podcast, so I don't think I'm repeating myself, how new public management became embedded in the first place, because that itself was a paradigm shift at the time. And the version of that I have in my head is there was a way of talking about this new way of working that was best captured in this book, Reinventing Government by Osborne and Gabler, which was actually based on cities in the US, I think was the main nexus they were writing about. And so there was a kind of body of work, much like there's a kind of body of work now around more complex, informed ways of working in the public sector. But in order for it to actually really progress, it had to get hitched to a political movement. And that political movement was initially the Clinton administration in the US. Basically, it's sort of the third way, that it's not about left or right, it's about what works. And managerialism basically slotted into that hand in glove, because and you're about what works, and here is something that is just about what works, and it's not about left or right, it's just about a new kind of better way of being a technocrat or a manager in public services. And once those two things were married, and they had in fact the sort of Reinventing Government Commission in the US that turbocharged it, and then Blair saw that and said, oh, that sounds like a pretty good strategy for what I'm trying to do, the same political narrative, and I can totally see how I can make that work managerially, if you like, in the United Kingdom. And then and then the story kind of continues on from there. So I wonder whether partially what we're about now is continuing to create and try and build the movement, but recognizing that we alone are not going to be the ones that are going to create that shift. At some point, though, I do believe something with some system will reach a tipping point where politically and broader in society, people will say, we cannot continue, we just cannot go on like this, we need something else. And at that moment, you need to be all of us need to be like, here it is, we've got it. And if there is a marriage with a political narrative, then you can suddenly make progress, which is why, somewhat optimistic, I started with the sort of leveling up Johnson-Gove axis, because you could see how there might be a kind of confluence there. It perhaps isn't quite the sort of tipping point, and therefore maybe there isn't the real burning platform for them to want to do the brave, bold thing, but it's not that it's in the opposite direction. It does feel like it's heading that way. So I do feel that the more we can do to continue to strengthen this movement, continue to build this thinking, to demonstrate in small areas where it works, to build a coalition of the willing, all of that good stuff. You never know when, next Tuesday afternoon, something could happen and suddenly it's like, you're on. Here's the spotlight clicks on, the stage is there, and we're standing there saying, okay, this is our moment, and we want to make sure we don't miss it, I suppose. So that's the sort of being aware of when that is, and recognizing that until there's a window for the system to shift, we can just play our part in kind of readying it as best we can.
There's a couple of things have been bubbling away from me that people have touched on that I think sort of connect into that. So, the sort of third way type thought, and Sam talked about, talking of climate change as sort of old paradigm, it's still the boxes. I wonder if our conversation that we had around power and control is also old paradigm. So the thought there being, I'm not sure anybody's saying, at least under some definition, that we should have less control. It's about what control means, or the locus of control, or something like that. And I wonder, therefore, if actually talking about power and control stokes fires we don't need to stoke, because one of the things I find myself talking about a lot when I'm working with organizations focused on self-management is, let's just not talk about it as self-management. Let's talk about it as responsibility. So where does responsibility for this thing here need to sit? let's, you know, who wants less responsibility in their organization, you know? So I wonder if that's one of the things we need to find a way to do. Maybe talks to Tim's point around, you know, what's the messaging for this, but I find myself personally drawn to this idea of let's talk about responsibility for this agenda as well as the self-management one, you know.
I think that is right, Andy. Although it does come back to the question of how radical do you want to be, because I think the point was made earlier that maybe not in these exact terms, but you know, control is an illusion. I've talked about the illusion of control in the past, and that's such an uncomfortable truth that it's almost unspeakable to say that all of this control we think we have over all of these systems and people's lives is an illusion, and it's all just a kind of artifact that we create through numbers and processes and other organizational systems. So in that sense, you're right that, you know, to talk about giving up control is to give up something which is illusory. It was illusory anyway. So what's the big deal? But the big deal is the amount of wasted energy that's directed towards something which is largely illusory and problematic. I think that's the difficulty, because whilst a system is oriented towards control, and again, also my language rather than others, I suppose, but I've often talked about CPI. We talk about optimizing for learning rather than control, and I think you can't. If you want to optimize for learning, you kind of have to give up on. You do have to let go of the control in order to optimize for learning. It is a bit hard to really do both, but unless you're willing to challenge that, ultimately, I think it's hard to just say, "Oh, don't worry about the control freaks. We'll just get on with our learning," because the control freaks you will be bound and held back by it, at least at some level in the system, until you're willing to challenge it somehow.
So let me test a distinction then and see if where it takes us, which is the difference between control and controls. Because I think we could treat control as an emergent property of doing the right things in the system. You know, it's an outcome rather than an input. But I think, again, you know, not saying I'm right in this, but the thing I have most of a problem with are the controls, not the outcome of things being in control. So targets, procedures, etc., being the controls.
On say, when, you know, I don't know, there's much value to it, but I'll give it a go. From say the work I do, like working with a team in an organization, I try not to use the word control because it's quite a triggering word. Either people feel, you know, it can be some, you know, I'm being controlled, or someone doesn't want to lose control. But if you've got any kind of group of people, I suppose team level, it might apply even to kind of like a nation state or something like that, is you do need things like coordination and cohesion, and you need to ensure that that get the balance of autonomy for the parts doesn't damage the whole, and sorts of things like that. And I wonder if that's a way of framing it that sort of gets the conversation away from control, but says more about things like coordination. And when I talk about these things, one guy I'm a bit inspired by, I'm no expert on him, but I find the story interesting about a guy called Stafford Beer, who in the 70s went to Chile with Aloud, I think was the guy in charge of Chile at the time, who wanted to create a socialist state, but to move away from the traditional sort of central controlling and central planning of socialism. And it didn't work because eventually there's a coup and Pinochet took over there. But it's just, and obviously how much you can apply from 1970s kind of technology for doing that, I don't know. But I think it's just an interesting challenge that they set themselves there. And I wonder if there's something to kind of be learned from there on that kind of governmental level, which I suppose is what you're interested in, Adrian.
I don't often quote Francis Maude, but you know, Francis Maude, when he was in his position of cabinet office minister under Cameron, I guess it was, when the coalition was talked about tight on values, loose on delivery, right? Which is a phrase which has been tried in different versions. And I think what you're talking about, Sam, is the importance of when you have a strong sense of shared purpose, common endeavor, the principles with which we are engaging, the values that are important to us, that allows us to collaborate, coordinate more easily, to have the sense that we're all walking in the same direction without the need necessarily to tell us all what to do. And that's, you know, that's a version of leadership, right? But whether, yeah, and then it's just semantics about whether you call it, is that control or is that something else? I would say it's sort of having and on the podcast I did talk about the iceberg, and the importance of going beneath the surface. And if you feel that you've got a strong sense of alignment on those deeper levels of mindsets and beliefs and assumptions, you don't need to waste all your time tinkering with the processes and the system, you know, above the surface, because they really will look after themselves. But it's deep work and it's hard work and it's uncomfortable work to go down beneath the surface. And people will worry it takes too long, or it's not going to achieve the results they want, and they won't get credit for what happens because they haven't told everybody what to do. But ultimately, I think that's what we're talking about, is whether you can call it control or not, but a deep sense of common endeavor, which is important. But if we can have public systems, so in my world, you know, if we can have governments and public systems that are focused on building a deep sense of shared endeavor and an alignment, and not being fearful of going there, I think that's kind of what we're arguing for. But I personally wouldn't call it control. I think that's the risk with calling it control, is that it like there's a similar argument with data. Like we can call everything data, like warm data, thick data, soft data, hard. I think in the end, you know, it doesn't mean anything, because you can just say, well, you know, the dream I had last night is data. But I think let's try and keep our terminology reasonably bounded, and then it avoids us slipping into sort of confusion in that sense. So Andy, I'm still fighting. I think I'm still fighting against control. Talk myself into it.
That's all right. And in the spirit of me not taking over, I'll not fight back for now, but we can save that one for over a beer. Folks, throwing it open again. Laura.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting, and then some of sort of listening sort of feels quite abstract in a way of, you know, yeah, the control's illusory, an illusion in a way, but then, you know, say you have teams of people being employed to collect unpaid, count someone who can't pay their council tax, or you know, you have, say, 10 professionals working around the one troubled family, all paid great, you know, all doing their job. That family doesn't get a penny, kind of thing. And then there's something about there's a bit of me that's going, but actually that's huge control over a lot of people. There is huge control, and it's very real. So I guess I'm struggling with the kind of abstract of, like, the control's illusory, but on the ground that I see, you know, I was so struck when we went into lockdown that some of the women we work with who'd come out of prison, and they were saying to me, well, we've always been in lockdown. This is great because everyone's in it now. We've always been told what to do. We've always been told where we can go. We've been locked up for a period of time, you know. And so I think it is illusion, but there is a huge amount of control over huge swathes of populations, and I guess I'm struggling to sort of how we connect that in a way.
It's a good point. I think when I talk anyway about control is illusory, I'm referring to over the outcomes, I guess, ... over the outcomes that really matter. So yes, I can control my kids by dictating to them when bedtime is, or, you know, what they eat, or things like that. But the outcome that I guess as a parent that really matters to me is that they grow up into really well-rounded, you know, wonderful contributing members of society, or whatever, happy and all the rest of it. And I can't control that in the same way that I can control when bedtime is. And actually, I can't even control when bedtime is. So that is an illusion in this household too. But that's what because I absolutely agree. There's a lot. It's the it's almost a result of the fact that control over what we really care about deep down is either illusory or extremely difficult. We end up controlling the stuff that's several degrees removed, or, you know, classic being the inputs rather than the outcomes, which is why I've had a decade-long argument about the social impact bonds, because I think they try to, that necessitates us saying that we're in control of something that we clearly are not, and then we just build these layers of metrics and stuff around it, and systems that make us feel really great about how we've solved something when we absolutely haven't. And that's the, so yes, and we're controlling something, but it's not actually the thing. We've kind of all wasted a load of effort to control something that didn't matter, or, you know, was several degrees away from what was important.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And actually, just interesting, I was just thinking when you said that about social impact bonds, the only social impact bond I've had an involvement with where people have loved it, it's not because, obviously, because it's 100% payment by results and all of this. It's the fact that because the commissioners are saying, we don't care what you do as long as you meet that target, the freedom they have, which they've never experienced in their life, in their working life, to just do whatever they think is the right thing to do, is amazing. So that's really that's really interesting. That's the good bit, isn't it? Which is what we should be doing anyway.
Exactly. Yeah, you don't need a social impact bond. That's my point. Is like social impact bonds are an extremely expensive, complicated way to just allow people to do the right thing.
I'm trying to stop short of wading in as well, because I'll just end up fighting on around control. So someone take me away from fighting about control. Tim.
Is there comfort in this? So I'm thinking about all the discomfort I'm feeling with having these conversations, and something I tell my girls all the time is, you know, we're trying to help them be comfortable being uncomfortable. But is there any comfort in this? Because I mean, that's very compelling about something that's I can wrap my arms around and have some hope or comfort with, as opposed to, you know, yeah, I think that's where if there have any thoughts on that. Where is the comfort or the compelling narrative that gets people to the other side of the discomfort of not having this control?
I can take a shot at this if I don't want to dominate, but I'll put a link in a second when I find it. I wrote a blog a couple of years ago, which was something like, the most powerful phrase a policymaker can say is, I don't know. Because it reveals humility, acceptance, openness to possibility, blah, blah, blah. And I think what saying I don't know actually does is it's just incredibly liberating. It's a release for people. So I'd say the hopeful thing of this is, if you, whilst it, of course it's scary, and I know that it's, and I don't want to make it sound simple when it's very hard to make these systems shift, but almost at a human level, once you accept the fact that you aren't expected to fix this solely, or that you are kind of solely accountable for making this change happen, and that you don't have all the answers, and you don't understand everything, and you can't understand everything, that's just a very liberating place to be. It just allows us to just relax and step back and say, I don't have to feel guilty that I haven't fixed this yet, and beat ourselves up and hold everybody accountable and be really angry with everybody all the time. So I would say I do find it hopeful. I find that a hopeful narrative, accepting the fact that it requires people to push. If you can push through that initial discomfort, when you get to the other side, you kind of released, I think.
Thanks, Adrian. I'll take a quick crack at that one too, because I I'm with you on everything you've just said, and I'd add into it that my personal experience of this work is that actually the comfort can come quite quickly on some fronts, particularly on the interpersonal fronts. So the difference in relationship between engaging around, if you like, the new public management type relationship you have with someone versus engaging with them around, you know, what matters to them and what's the legacy they're trying to leave, and you know, what does it makes them tick as a human being. That I think there's enormous comfort in that. I often use the word fellowship around that, and I think the sense of fellowship you get from this work almost immediately, I think, is a huge part of the comfort. But to Adrian's point earlier, I think that is easiest to find if you're working with people that are already sort of experiencing some disquiet and so on. I think the tortuous and not that rewarding version of trying it is trying to convince the unconvincible. Folks, we've got about 2 more minutes left. Can I just throw it open one last time before we say thanks and go on our separate ways? Anyone like to come in?
Do you see any role for journalism and the media, or is that kind of old paradigm stuff as well? Or, you know, is there any, I hesitate to use the word hope in Andy's presence, but is there any kind of opportunity there where there might be people who are kind of more on board with a different way of thinking?
I do think that if we let go of the importance of a free and fair media that is able to, as I would describe it, they are part of our societal sense-making infrastructure, right? And I think that is being degraded as we speak in the United States, in the United Kingdom, and other places for a whole variety of reasons, not least like the effects of the sort of polarizing effects of social media. But if we do not have, it's hard to imagine which other bit of society can play that role. And if we're willing to just let it go, I think we've been very casual about letting go of the quality of that commentary on society and inquiry on all of our behalves. So I see it as enormously important. I've got no idea how to fix it or how to turn the tide, but I see it as very, very important.
I was thinking something earlier, actually, when you mentioned about, you know, a tipping point might be on the way, Adrian, because I actually thought about the media then, because if we go back to the conversation at the beginning about people giving up control. Now, your work is with governments, and most government and political systems are based on the main aim is to stay in power. And one way to stay in power is to have lots of the media telling the narrative that you want to have. And so that's what I wonder about when you said about a tipping point. I hope you can bleep the recording, Andy, because when you said that, I just thought, well, with this tipping point, how much more fucked do we need to be? Because and I think the media has a big role in that tipping point not happening, because it's the job of certain bits of the media is to keep those in power. So that's, I think, a problem with reaching that tipping point or making us all aware of it.
Thanks, Sam. Well, I'm delighted for the first time, I think, ever in a call, I wasn't the first person to swear, and you managed to get it in before the clock turned 2. So well done, mate. I'm actually genuinely gutted to be pulling us to a close, but we do have to close, I'm afraid. So let me just say thank you, first of all, to Adrian for being prepared to do this and providing this sort of stimulus to get us going. Adrian, really appreciate it, and I've thoroughly enjoyed it. I hope it's been useful for you, but also
yes, thank you.
And thank you to everyone, because you know the value of these is in the discussion we all have. So hope it's been useful for everyone. For those of you that this is the first time joining one of these calls, we run them roughly monthly. So if you'd like to come back for future ones, you can find them on nextstageradicals.net/events. There's always something going on. But thank you so much for your time today, folks.
Thanks, everyone.